think we need to slow down. I think the pace of technology and innovation pushes us really quickly, and I don't think that's actually conducive to learning. We have to start fundamentally with how do we think? Mm-hmm. And in order for us to think, we need to have the space to think. Because I feel what ends up happening right when you come into university or when you come into any educational setting is it's always about what are the objectives and what are the outcomes. Mm-hmm. And those are always very tangible in terms of assignments or readings or quizzes. But it's not really thinking about how is that knowledge transforming the individual.
Welcome back to Wise on Air, the show where we talk to the world's leading minds on the future of education. My name is Bassem Hijazi, producer of the show. In an era where information is more accessible than ever before, a fundamental question emerges about the purpose of why we learn. Are we simply transferring knowledge, or are we cultivating values and character? As educational systems worldwide grapple with rapid technological change, the role of values in learning has become increasingly complex. We have unprecedented access to information, yet struggle with issues of wisdom and discernment. We celebrate personalized learning while recognizing the importance of community and shared values. And we embrace innovation while seeking to preserve cultural knowledge and traditions. How do we make sense of all this? Our guest today offers unique insights into these challenges. Dr. Sohaira Siddiqui serves as Executive Director of Al-Mujadilah Center Mosque for Women in Qatar, an institution that functions as both a learning space and community hub. She is also an Associate Professor of Islamic Studies at Georgetown University, Qatar, bringing both academic expertise and practical experience in institution building. Through her work at Al-Mujadilah, Dr. Siddiqui has created educational programs that span from gardening to Islamic law, all unified by a commitment to developing analytical thinking within a value-based framework. So in this episode, WISE Research Manager Reema Salati explores with Dr. Siddiqui how values can and should shape educational models, the continued importance of physical learning communities in our digital age, and what global education systems might learn from approaches that put values at the center of learning.
I think the first question, just delving into it, is are universities teaching values today? And if not, what should universities ultimately be teaching?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me. I'm excited for the conversation. You started off in a very loaded way. So the question, I think, of values, universities have gone through a transition. I would say all educational institutions have gone through a transition maybe in the last 20 to 30 years to think about what is the ultimate goal that we're trying to do with education. Being at Georgetown, Qatar, we've had this conversation a lot. And I would say the biggest shift that I've seen within higher education and universities is originally universities, it was a matter of giving people very specific skills so that they can go into very specific careers. Whereas now what's happening more and more, and the conversation is happening at the professor level, it's happening at the administrative level, is not so much what are the kind of hard skills that we're giving students, but how are we shaping individuals in a way that they can be agile, and a way that they can go and be impactful in their communities and in their societies. And so it's a matter now of trying to get that balance between, yes, universities need to give students skills for the workplace, but you can't just focus on the skills. You need to start focusing on the types of values that you're inculcating within students so that when they get into the workplace, that they can also bring, I would say, like a way of being and engaging that is more than just their skill set.
Mm-hmm. So we heard a lot of your conversations in previous interviews, and I sort of want to delve into this idea of the way you're teaching students. So sort of looking at how to analyze the information rather than feeding them the answers. So how does that approach sort of connect with values and what type of education we should instill within these students?
So I think one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing kind of as an educator, and I think this is in part coming because of the pace of technological innovation at this moment, is we're losing kind of that sense of curiosity amongst the students and the idea of slow reading and synthesis. what ends up happening oftentimes with students is it's a matter of just producing a paper, or it's a matter of just getting an A on a final, or it's a matter of passing a class. And so I think what ends up happening is students are trying to process high volumes of information. They're struggling with it. And so you're relying on technology. The biggest kind of new innovation, of course, is AI. And so I've, spoken quite openly with some of my students about it. And they say oftentimes they will take an article and they'll drop it into ChatGPT and they'll say, give me a summary. And ChatGPT is really good with these types of things. So it gives the student a good summary such that they can come into class, they can answer the question, they can even memorize the top line points, they can take a quiz, but they're not actually thinking through that information. And so for me in the classroom, the value that I'm constantly trying to inculcate within the students is this love of curiosity, this desire to take something and want to delve deeper into it. So it's not just a matter of reading an article because I need to, complete the assignment and I need to take the quiz and I need to get the A on the paper. But I really have this question, or this paper is posing this question. I want to understand what that is, how they've gone about answering it, what that means for me. And that entire process is much more slow than I think kind of the general education system is right now. So the challenge that students are having is you have to take a high volume of courses, you have to do a lot of assignments, you have to perform in all of these things, and that's pushing them to go at a very fast pace. But the real work of education, the real work of reading, the real work of analysis and thinking is actually very, very slow. So how do we as educators then balance that within the classroom? And so for me, at the heart of it has to stand this question of like intellectual curiosity. And that will push students, I would hope, to be a bit more slow and to value that process of education more than just coming into a class and doing the work.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that. At the WISE 12 Summit this year that's happening in November, the main theme behind it is sort of putting human at the center. And I think in the recent years, we sort of lost touch given the high development of technology and AI. So do you find yourself within the university classroom, like trying to instill human values within students? Do you think like that aspect is sort of lost? Do you find like you have to reteach students how to be humans? Is that what we're?
I think there's an element of, I don't think it's having to teach people how to be human, but I think I was having this conversation with this theology professor the other day in Georgetown who came from the main campus. And he was saying that one of the most important things he thinks we need to inculcate is this idea of sohba, which is kind of an Islamic concept, which is not just kind of like friendship, but almost a sense of fraternity or connection, and that deep human connection. And the idea is that learning does not simply take place by reading. That's a big part of it, but learning and understanding also takes place by connecting with other individuals.
Yeah.
And there's ways of knowing, there's ways of being, there's ways of understanding that you simply get through that human connection.
Yeah.
And so a large part of what I try to do in the classroom is create those spaces where the students come in and they actually get to know one another a bit more. What are the questions that, my fellow colleague is asking? Even what the name of the person who's sitting next to me is. I oftentimes tell my students, it's very strange that you would spend 14 weeks sitting next to somebody and not know their name.
Yeah.
But the fact that that's where we have gone, where we can all come into a classroom and we can sit next to one another and I can do my paper and we have this informal WhatsApp chat in which we're asking questions. I'm missing a class, send me the notes. But I really have no understanding of who the person is sitting next to me, why this knowledge matters to them, why it matters to me. So creating that space to value that human connection, I think is really crucial. And it's something as universities are growing, we're not doing, because by the way that the university is structured, it is a less intimate space than school. And one of the hardest things I've seen, especially for freshman students, when they go from the transition of being in high school to university is in high school, everybody in your class, you're all shuffling to the classrooms together. Your teacher knows your name. They know your birthday. They know your parents. They know you are an individual to be recognized and acknowledged in high school. And then you go to university and all of a sudden you have 7 different professors in a day. You have 150 students in your batch. Nobody knows your name.
Yeah.
And there's a way in which that individual can be lost in the system. And what we have to do, I think, a better job of in the university is, think about values, but also think about community and how to connect students with one another so that they don't feel like they're just coming in as disconnected individuals, but they're on kind of a learning journey together.
I think also you talking about like learning spaces and community. Al-Mujadilah is sort of being a mosque and a women's center. It's sort of a learning space for women, right? So what are sort of the specific gaps you were trying to fill when Al-Mujadilah was established?
Yeah, the story of Mujadilah, I think, there's 2 ways to tell the story of Mujadilah. I think there is a way to kind of tell the story of Mujadilah of, what happened the 6 months before we decided to open it. But I think there's a way to tell the story of Mujadilah that's much more rich and I think deeply connected to the Islamic tradition. And that, I think, is the real story of Mujadilah, which is, I think, the story of mosques in Islamic history. So the first thing that the Prophet ﷺ did when he went to Medina was to create a mosque. And even when he was in Mecca, after he received revelation, there would be classes that would be taught. They were private classes, but they would be taught. And the idea of, creating spaces that are for learning, that are centered on human beings and what they need is, I think, foundational to every religious tradition. And mosques have always played that role in Muslim societies. And this is the beauty of if you go to anywhere in the Muslim world, where you've had kind of the Islamic civilization spread, one of the kind of architectural remnants, regardless of where you go in the Muslim world, is the mosque, because it was so central.
Yeah.
And I think, then thinking about Mujadilah, it was really this question of, well, what can the mosque mean for Muslim women today? And are Muslim women still connected to the mosque in the same way that they were historically connected to the mosque? And if not, why not? And I think those were the types of questions that we were asking. I think Education City is always understood that religion, education, and development are connected. So the first mosque in education, Minaratain, that mosque is in the middle, and the entire university is built around it, right? With that same idea of the mosque as kind of the center. And so we tried to think about, what are the needs of contemporary Muslim women? What are some of the challenges that they're facing? How can we address the integrated needs from within a religious framework? And that made us decide that, creating not just a mosque, but a place of public education, a place of research, a place of engagement was really kind of the way forward to address the needs of Muslim women today.
Yeah. I think that brings me sort of, since we covered values, we covered, classroom, in terms of, let's say, important skills that people should learn, right? It's not all covered within the educational curriculums that are offered. So what do you think the most important skills that people should be learning today?
It's a tough question. I don't think is a single answer. And the way that we structured kind of the learning pathways of Mujadilah is to recognize that fundamentally Muslim women need different things at different times in their life. And that's all human beings. So, usually we think about education as primary, secondary, university, and then, executive education, career development. And what we're trying to do at Mujadilah is to say, okay, let's create another space where Muslim women can have learning opportunities that align with where they are in their lives and the challenges that they're going through. So I'll give you an example. Right now we have 17 different classes running. Just in the last couple of days, we've had a lecture on for Muslim women who have autistic children. We've had a pre-marriage workshop. We've had a class on journaling the Sira. We've had a tajweed course, Arabic course, a class on fiqh al-buyut, like household, how the Prophet was, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, within his house life. We have a class on hadith coming up. And if you look at all of those offerings, they're all speaking to a woman in a different stage of her life. Are you about to get married and you need a pre-marriage course? Are you a mother struggling with raising children?
Yeah.
Are you, trying to get closer to the Quran after Ramadan? Are you just we have majlises, are you just interested in creating a community? So what we try to say at Mujadilah is you as a woman fundamentally know what you need. And we as an organization know that it is important to offer spaces for community building and development. And you can come and see what we have to offer. And depending on where you are in your journey, then you can take kind of an offering that we have. And when we design from an education and a programming perspective, we kind of think about things in three core areas. There's the religious development and confidence of Muslim women. There's their kind of integrated well-being. And then there's their community connection. And all of our courses fall into one of those buckets. And if you come in and if you're yearning for that community connection, you'll see 5 courses. If you're yearning for your own personal self-development, you'll see a bunch of courses. If you're yearning for a deeper understanding of your religious tradition, then you'll see a bunch of courses. And so it is designed in a way that's flexible and tries to recognize you're going to need different things at different times in life. And we're here to try to be part of that.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that Al-Mujadilah sort of uses traditional knowledge and the wealth that it has to sort of address contemporary challenges. I think the next question here is sort of how do you come up with what these contemporary challenges are, and how do you design your programs in a way that it feeds into the needs of the community? And also looking at it past, education, and also addressing the different age groups, I would say, that visit Al-Mujadilah and attend these courses.
Program design is always a real challenge. And because I wear the hat of Georgetown and I wear the hat of Mujadilah, I see kind of program design in 2 completely different ways. When we have to design a class, for example, at Georgetown, there's a real structure to it. You have to go in, you have to propose a course. This is how it fits into the major. This is, there's a whole process of review, and it takes actually a long time to add a course.
Yeah.
And then you have the core degree, which just never changes unless, maybe once every 10 years. At Mujadilah, it's very different because we are trying to create kind of an ecosystem in which we design in response to what the community needs. And the way we do that is, one, we're always kind of running focus groups and conversations with Muslim women. The majority of people that work at Mujadilah are Muslim women. So I always say, like, every meeting we have could be a focus group if we wanted it to be. But the other element of it is also we're doing research. So we have a big part of our work, which is public education. The other part of our work is research. And our research is not just researchers here in Qatar, but internationally as well. And we're always asking for women to research on issues that are impacting women. And we take those findings and we take a lot of those insights and we think about, okay, how do we design a program around this? We also work with a lot of partners. So for example, we worked with Sidra to design a course specifically around maternal health and well-being. And so for us, because we don't have the strictures of the university in terms of this is how many contact hours you need, and this is how to get a course approved, and this is how many credits it needs to have, Mujadilah is able to design in a really agile way, in a really responsive way. If we have enough people that come to us and say, we need a course on gardening, 48 hours later, we can have a gardening course. So that I think is really, it makes Mujadilah really special because it doesn't force us to be confined to a specific way of teaching and designing.
We're in this beautiful building today. And I wanted to understand sort of how the space and the way the center is set up in the building and how it is having the center in the middle and sort of an open space. And how does that differentiate from a university classroom setting? What is the added value of having a beautiful building like this?
Yeah, I think it's an important question because space has such an impact on people. There's so many studies actually done on the way even people's physiology kind of is affected by light and space. And that's something I think that's really important for a project like Mujadilah because it's not, again, a traditional university. It's not a traditional kind of educational center, but it's really rooted in this idea that we're trying to uplift Muslim women and connect them with their faith, and at the same time address their contemporary needs. And so one of the most beautiful things about Mujadilah when you walk into it is, I always say this to people, you're in Mujadilah. You don't have to go through any corridors. You walk in and you have these, two beautiful trees in the middle, resembling the kind of old courtyards you used to have in mosques. And the biggest space that we have and the most kind of elevated space that we have is the space of the mosque. Recognizing that that is a relationship we're trying to cultivate between ultimately the individual and God, which is that upward relationship. So you have this kind of very high point of the building. And then on the other end of the building, the roof it's undulating, it goes down and creates a really intimate space for conversation, where you've got the classrooms and you've got the library and you've got what we call a multi-purpose hall. And the idea is to then bring it down to the individual and to the community. And so we try to create a space both of elevation and connection, while at the same time creating the space of intimacy and connection to individuals and society. And so the architecture becomes really important. And I think women are connectors naturally. They connect through being in shared spaces together, through conversation. And so when the idea of, creating something for women came, we wanted to make sure that it was a building that could really speak to Muslim women, that they could come in and they could feel relaxed in. They could spend an entire day here. They could be in the library, they could be in the classroom, they could be in the cafe, they can easily pray, they can take a walk around the gardens. And we're starting to see now that we've been open, alhamdulillah, for 14 months, that there are women that now come and spend the entire day here. And they do so because they say it's such a peaceful place for them. So I think space and the way we feel in space is so deeply connected. That we wouldn't be able to really fulfill our mission and vision without creating a space that supports it.
I think also speaking about the mission and vision of Al-Mujadilah, how do you, with the programs that you deliver, how do you measure the impact of, the programs that go on within Al-Mujadilah?
It's, I think the hardest question that educators have to answer is this question of impact. Even in the university, we struggle with this because professors are writing articles in books and, maybe 24 people are reading it. Is that impactful scholarship? At Mujadilah, we do have, we try to kind of ask this question of how do we measure the type of behavioral change that we're looking for? Because we're really looking for an increase in religious confidence and resilience. We're looking for a greater sense of well-being amongst Muslim women, a greater sense of community cohesion. And those things you can't really measure in the short term that easily. So there are certain kind of quantitative things that we look at, which is, number of people that are taking programs, that are re-registering in programs, looking at pre and post surveys in terms of learning outcomes. And I think those are kind of the traditional ways that we measure impact. But then there's the non-traditional ways, which is through understanding the stories and the women who are coming to Mujadilah and the connections that they're making at Mujadilah and why they keep coming back and what they find here. And so because it is a community center, if you're a woman who comes to Mujadilah a few times a week, we already recognize who you are. So we can easily go to you and have that conversation and say, can you just sit down with us for 20 minutes and tell us about your experience? Ramadan is a really, really busy time here. We have thousands of people that come through in Ramadan, and you start to see that certain women will be here almost every single day, and that those women start to come and they're, giving food to different people, and they're sending gifts to Mujadilah, and they're, they're coming to us and giving feedback, and they're cooking, and they have all these ideas that they want to implement in Mujadilah in terms of programming and suggestions. So for us, it's a matter of capturing the quantitative kind of data that we look at, but then also really finding those human connections and trying to tell those stories about the individuals and how they've been impacted by the institution.
Yeah, I think we covered sort of the traditional and non-traditional forms of learning and how important learning spaces are, given the different educational approaches and trends that are happening. So which emerging educational models do you find more promising given the educational landscape at the current moment?
I think education right now, with technology is kind of in flux, where the pace at which education is adapting to new technological tools and resources, it's almost like the educational institutions can't keep up with it. And that is a real struggle. What we're trying to do, I think, at Mujadilah is we don't actually really use technology in the classroom in that same way. We approach it from more of like an Islamic educational pedagogical perspective, which is the idea of tarbiyah. So trying to understand what are kind of the intellectual, the physical, the spiritual, religious needs of individuals, and how can you ensure that a person is constantly growing in all of those areas throughout their life. So if we think about it in kind of secular terminology, that's lifelong learning. The idea that you're always supposed to be developing as an individual. But within kind of an Islamic educational framework, it is this idea that you as an individual should always be striving to improve yourself and your relationship with Allah and your relationship with your community and your society. And so what we try to do is take that as the starting point and say, how can we create opportunities for people that are it's not just feeding them intellectually, but feeding them like religiously, and allows them for that type of growth that we think is much more fundamental. And the type of growth that is often neglected in other spaces, especially for women once they graduate university, because then you get really busy working, or you're really busy as a mother, or you're really busy in all of these other social roles that you play. So what happens to your own personal sense of development? What happens to your own religious growth? And so in that sense, our philosophy is slightly different than maybe what you would encounter if you are taking kind of lifelong learning courses somewhere else.
Yeah. I think you really highlighted on this communal values kind of approach as well. However, we also do see an increased demand or need for people to have more personalized learning. I think this is tension within the educational landscape that's currently happening. So how do you balance both?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've found at Mujadilah is if you keep the setting intimate enough, you can hold space for both the communal and the individual. So for example, just a few days ago, we had the lecture on for mothers with autistic children. And it was about 60, 70 women attended that. And the first part of it was kind of general for everybody. But the second part of it was a conversation in which women could ask questions and engage with one another. And the heart of what we try to do at Mujadilah is create spaces where women can ask questions, the idea of dialogue, the idea of connection. So, sometimes what ends up happening is if you put 50 people in a room and you just tell them something, that's not really going to speak to the individual. So what we try to do in our design process is think about how can we, establish a common conversation, something that is important to the entire group. And then how do we transition that into then the individual needs? So even in a course, for example, like we have our course running right now, Journaling the Seerah, you have the instructor that tells you, paints for you a picture of the Seerah, a certain time in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then she works with each individual to say, okay, how do you visualize that as an individual? What are the colors? Why those colors? How do you put that together in a visual representation? So we try to balance in terms of the human connection between the group and the individual. And we find that by creating those spaces for conversation and connection and dialogue, you can have both. And it doesn't have to be either the communal or the individual, but it can coexist.
Yeah. And I think at WISE, we've seen different educational models that succeed in both. And there's a lot going on within the global education systems as a whole. And I think being able to bring people together and talk about things is really important. So I think I'm going to jump straight into this. If you could change one thing about the global education system, what would it be?
I'll go back to what I started with, that I think we need to slow down. I think the pace of technology and innovation pushes us really quickly. And I don't think that that's actually conducive to learning. When I teach my freshmen, we have this class at Georgetown called the Pro Seminar, which every single freshman has to take. And I assign them always 3 readings to begin with. One is on boredom, one is on thinking, and then one is on writing. And the idea of those readings that I give them is to say, you know, we have to start fundamentally with how do we think? And in order for us to think, we need to have the space to think. And this is this idea of boredom, which is not boredom in the sense of I don't know what to do, but it's this idea of I need to be in a space where there is stillness so that I can actually reflect more deeply. And the reason I always start my students with that is because I feel what ends up happening right when you come into university or when you come into any educational setting is it's always about what are the objectives and what are the outcomes. And those are always, you know, very tangible in terms of assignments or readings or quizzes. But it's not really thinking about how is that knowledge transforming the individual. And from an Islamic perspective, knowledge is only knowledge to the extent that it transforms an individual. And there's this really beautiful story of Imam Ghazali in which he ends up having this crisis. But the reason he has this crisis is because all of his books are stolen from him. And he says to somebody like, I've lost my knowledge, right? I've lost all of these books. And someone responds to him and says, well, then it wasn't knowledge. They were just your books, right? And then he goes on this process of really internalizing that knowledge. And too much now, I think, of what happens in education is we're trying to get the degrees and we're trying to get the qualifications and the papers. And we're not thinking that knowledge and education is fundamentally what transforms the human being. And if knowledge transforms you in a positive way, then when you go out into the world, then you can transform the world in a positive way. And so for me, if I could change one thing, it would actually be to slow down. So I'm always the professor in faculty meetings who's saying, I think we should have less credits and I think we should teach less courses. Like giving 6 courses to a student in a semester is too much. Maybe we should think about taking it down to 5 or 4 and really let them live with that knowledge and breathe that knowledge, and us ask the question of what are we seeking to aim really at the end of the semester when we teach these students. And I think the biggest tension we're having is not the kind of like the communal individual one. I think it's the pace of technology and the pace of society is so quick. And the way in which people actually learn should be very slow. So how do we find the middle ground?
So you highlighted a lot on a lot of great points, and I think going back to trying to understand, can we find the middle ground, or are we just expected to keep going in this, in this overwhelming situation of the student needing to complete and fulfilling all these requirements in order to get the degree?
I think intention. The intention of the educator has to be really important in this, that most of the time when we think about what is the actual requirement, it's not like accreditation is not necessarily based on assignments. It's based on contact hours and content. And I think that works to the advantage of educators who want to slow down. So if, for example, as a Georgetown professor, I wanted to omit every single paper in my course, and I wanted to say that my students only have to read 100 pages, that's fine. I have the right to do that as the professor. So I think those of us who are in the positions where we're designing courses and we're teaching, we need to be very intentional about how are we getting students from A to B? Like, what are we really trying to teach them? What are we really trying to educate? And are these assignments and are these readings the best way to get us there? Or have we just gotten used to our syllabus and the students have gotten used to our syllabus? It's predictable, it's easy. So khalas, we keep going. And I would say, the technological revolution that happened with AI has impacted education across the board. But if I was to take a poll of how many professors really went back to their syllabi and said, okay, now AI is everywhere, how do I redesign? I would say maybe 15% of professors have redesigned their syllabi, taking into consideration now that AI is being used as part of the learning, writing process. And so I think oftentimes what ends up happening is, as educators, we can get really comfortable, right? That our classes were working so they can continue to work. But what we have to do is fundamentally realize that our students have shifted and how their learning has shifted. And we have to be much more mindful about how we are then kind of changing our papers and our assignments and our classes and everything to kind of maybe slow it down a bit, and really get them into the material a bit more. I think one of the simplest things, and if any of my students are listening to this, they'll probably roll their eyes, is getting rid of papers, because I'm having them write papers right now. But I am moving in a direction of saying, maybe we don't write papers anymore. And maybe you guys go to the library and you get 15 sources, and I want you to read those sources. And then I want you to just come and have a 30-minute conversation with me in my office about them. And then it becomes more about them reading, understanding, and articulating than necessarily reading, understanding, and writing. So I think professors have a big role to play in slowing down.
You highlighted a lot on slowing down and taking it slow within education. And considering that you're an executive director at Al-Mujadilah, you're an associate professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, you're also a mother of 2 children. How do you slow down?
It's a question, it's a challenge, and it's one that I probably struggle with every single day. The way that I handle it is I try to think of wherever I am to be fully present in that moment. Like, what is that moment asking of me, and what is my role in that moment? So when I'm at Mujadilah, I am the executive director here, and it is my job to be fully present for everybody that works here and the institution. And I try to just dedicate myself to that work while I'm here. And then when I'm at Georgetown, which is a completely different atmosphere, I try to dedicate myself fully to my students and being present for what they need in terms of their learning and in terms of my teaching. And then when I'm at home, I think part of the problem is we go home and we're still on our phones and we're still answering emails and we're still doing all of these different things. And that is the challenge of being connected to everything, is you're still answering emails from Georgetown and you're still answering emails from Mujadilah while you're trying to feed your children. And I try not to do that. I try to say, these are roles that I play. And in order for me to play these roles effectively, I have to play them fully when I'm in them. And the role, I think, that really supports my ability to do the work at Mujadilah and the work at Georgetown is my role as a mother. And I didn't think I would say that, but it provides a deep sense of grounding and a deep sense of joy and fulfillment that allows you to be in these other spaces. And so for me, it's that element of presence, but also you as an individual have to feel joy and you have to feel that sense of fulfillment. And then you carry that into other spaces, and that allows you to be present.
And I think you carry it very well.
Thank you.
I think also going back to your role as Al-Mujadilah, what's next for Al-Mujadilah?
We're always planning. So the first year was really about establishing Al-Mujadilah in the community with our programming and our research. What's next is we do want to create more defined learning pathways for the women who come to Mujadilah in those areas I had mentioned: religious education, personal development, and community engagement. And then on the research side, we want to get more into really starting to hone down on 3 or 4 issues that we think are really important for Muslim women, and starting doing targeted research around those areas, connecting with Muslim women globally. And the last thing that we want to do is to try to present Mujadilah as a model for faith-based community education that is meaningful to the world, because I think there's a way in which Mujadilah can contribute to larger conversations and present something unique that doesn't exist elsewhere. And so part of it is now saying, we're working and we've done this for 14 months, which, might not seem like a long time, but I think we've gathered enough information in that time that now we can go out and say, what can we learn from you and what can you learn from us? And so I think that's the next step.
Yeah. I think also thinking of your role in Georgetown as a professor, associate professor, and then Al-Mujadilah as well, what sort of, you have, I would say, a traditional and non-traditional educational hat. So what gives you hope in the future of education?
Education, I think for me is an open playing field, and it's a very, very dynamic space. There are some, professions that you go into and, there isn't a lot of change, but education has to be responsive. And so what gives me hope is that the conversations are happening. They're happening between professors and students. They're happening between students. They're happening between professors themselves. Yeah. So I think as long as the conversations are happening, as long as there's curiosity and as long as there's space for learning, I think education remains to be a rich playing field of ideas.
Dr. Sohaira, thank you so much for joining us on The Wise on Air.
Thanks for having me.